we'll go ahead and get started. So good evening, and thank you all for joining us tonight for a very special Face It Live Q&A session presented by Fayette County Public Schools and the 16th District PTA. During this time, it is most important that our families and communities stay engaged together and support one another.
Absolutely. The Face It platform allows us to virtually have real talk, build real partnerships, and allow real ways for us to express what we're feeling, exert our energy in a positive way, and be solution-driven in our approach to whatever we are facing in our communities. I am Sharika Smith. I work for Fayette County Public Schools in the Office of Student Support.
She's awesome. I am Melody Westerfield, the FACE, the Family and Community Engagement Coordinator located at William Wells Brown Elementary School. And as COVID continues to be a big overshadowing factor in our lives, it seems that the one thing that causes us to have the anxiety and be exhausted in 2020 is like the one thing that's causing all these, anxiety issues, right? And so when we think about the work-life balance, our family and community, there are a lot of challenges that we are facing in our society, from mental health to social injustice to educational challenges, to even gun violence. And so we decided to create a collective 3-part trauma series for which we are already addressed the definition of trauma, right? And as it pertains to gun violence, depression and suicide trauma. And so we have talked about those things on previous shows. And so we invite you to go back and watch those shows. It's on our Face It page. It's a lot of great information from a lot of great people, and feel free to comment. We will follow back up with you, right? And so we know that these are the subjects that are impacting our families and our children in the most profound and frightening way.
Yeah. So as we navigate this discussion of collective trauma, we understand that the topics can get really heavy and really deep. So if you are viewing this at home, check yourself, right? If you have to step away from the conversation and come back, that's completely okay. This is being recorded, so you can watch it later if you need to. So please be in tune with yourself and take care of each other. So that said, our subject tonight is going to, again, like we said, focus on trauma, but more specifically racial trauma. Every definition, like we said, we'll kind of review what trauma means and just kind of really understand the underlying root of a bigger picture. And although the conversation is geared toward youth, this chat's going to address the adult aspects of these topics as well. We all know that racial trauma is a public health epidemic. We have some amazing people this evening to help us navigate this conversation. So let's start by introducing our guest for tonight. Quentin Murdoch, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Quentin Murdoch. I'm a Fayette County Public Schools social worker. I also co-facilitate a program called MAID. I'm happy to be here in service, and hope the conversation is wonderful, as I know it will be.
Absolutely, welcome. We're excited to have you. And then Ms. Jardin Dogan, please introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jardin Dogan. I am a doctoral candidate in counseling psychology at UK, University of Kentucky, where I study race-related stress and racial trauma among Black Americans. And so I'm super excited to be here. I love these conversations, and I'm just already feeling the energy. So if you feel the energy too, drop any kind of comments or questions in the chat.
Absolutely.
We all got this energy thing going on. I'm so excited about it. So I'm gonna jump us off real quick. This question is for the both of you all. And so in your own unique way and your own professional way, tell us what collective trauma is and how does that impact me, my child, and my community? What's the signs that, we should be looking for in our everyday life when it comes to the collective trauma? So I invite Quentin to go first, and then Jardin follow behind him.
Okay. I think racial trauma can show up in several different ways. First of all, I think it's very important to know how you identify yourself. That's very important. I think racial trauma can show up, and it can look like racial profiling, the presumption of guilt. It can look like stress-related disorders, mental health issues. It can look like inequity in housing. It can look like someone described it as death by 1,000 cuts.
Mm.
So it's those things that really impact you that you know are based on your race. And I think it presents in different ways. I think it can feel and look like fear, numbness, anger, depression, frustration, shutting down, isolation. So those are some of the symptoms of the stressors that we have every day.
Mhm.
I think it's important to note that, Africans, when we first arrived, many as slaves, unfortunately, we were distinguished by the color of our skin. And so I believe that was the beginning of being Black and stressed in America.
Mhm.
And so I think it's very important. What it looks like depends on the individual and what it feels like to you.
Okay. So
Mhm.
you have given us racial trauma. Jordan, I want you to give us collective trauma, period, and then you can give us racial trauma after you give us what collective trauma is, right?
Got it. Yeah. So how I explain trauma in general is that if you can think of a chain, it's like a kink in your chain, right? So it's an experience or an event that happens that really just you can't move past it. And so
Mhm.
collectively, because we are communal people and that's just our culture, trauma can be passed through us, right? So we can be walking trauma and we can spread that to our children, whether that be in utero, whether that be in conversation, whether that be in energy, right? We talked about energy, but also collectively, because we live amongst each other, a lot of us live in urban areas, we are surrounded by a lot of trauma, right? And so I think that Mr. Quentin had a good point about the fact that all of those signs and symptoms can be passed along to each other via learned behavior. And
Mhm.
so you may learn to be fearful because of your trauma, and then you may pass that on to your children. So that's how collective trauma kind of shows up. And then when we talk about racial trauma, that's adding the racial pieces to it, right? So we're talking about, you're on social media, you're scrolling through and you see a video that is just highly traumatic of someone who looks like you being murdered by the police. Automatically, you're going to feel some type of way, right? But you may experience it in your body, you may experience it emotionally. You also may have these thoughts of like, wow, that person looks like me. What if this happens to me when I walk outside? So all of those things kind of play a role, but especially racially as people, then that compounds the trauma that we already experience and just life stressors, right? Life is already hard, but then you add race and other identities to it, then that's where we see trauma really happen.
That's so good, right?
So you kind of touched on this already, but I kind of want to elaborate just a little bit. And Quentin, you may have something to add. How do we see racial trauma displayed within our community? Jordan, you mentioned it on social media, but how else, specifically in our community, do we see racial trauma?
I think, it's collective in the fact that it's something that we see and absorb constantly. If you look at the media, one of the most traumatic events in history was the murder of Emmett Till, and seeing his body that was deformed and beating, and that image. And then in 2020, when we see people murdered again like that, it's a historic memory.
Mhm.
I've even heard post-traumatic stress disorder when it comes to race as described as post-traumatic slave disorder, because it is a history.
Mhm.
So I think it shows up in many ways. I think it shows up as microaggressions, micro assaults, not acknowledging someone's oppression, not saying that it's real. I think these are conversations that we need to have, which is why this is a great platform right now.
Right.
Mhm. Yeah, I'll add to that by saying that, sometimes with trauma, what we think is that we have to experience it, but sometimes just observing it or hearing about it can also be traumatic, right? Like if we have a loved one, we do a lot of research on vicarious racial trauma. And if you have a loved one who comes home and says, this happened to me at work, and you're talking about it and you're giving details, just hearing that sometimes can produce a lot of symptoms and fear, sadness, embarrassment, humiliation, shame, all of those things can come up. So even secondarily, right? So you could be connected to someone and still experience it. And so I think that's where collective trauma shows up. But especially when we're talking about racism, that's just rampant, especially right now. We're
Mhm.
probably all likely experiencing some form of racial trauma that we're trying to overcome.
Right. Right.
Wow.
So, I mean, okay, how does that impact my child in the future? Like, if I'm a parent, how does that impact my my child in the future? And what happens if we recognize that it has impacted our child and we didn't get help? It goes untreated. Like, what does untreated that trauma, how does that impact our children? Heck, how does that impact me?
Mhm.
So,
I-
either one of you jump in. Yeah.
You want me to go? Okay.
Yeah.
So I think there's a time component to racial trauma, right? So like when something racist happens, we experience reactions in the moment. And so
Mhm.
that's where a lot of our research at UK focuses on. But I think long term, if it's untreated, what we see are a lot of mental health issues, like Mr. Quentin said. We see anxiety, depression, nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, constantly looking over your shoulder, just feeling really unsafe and feeling really uncertain. But I think also long term, what we see are health problems, right? We see drug use, we see sleeping problems, we see heart disease, we see, just all of these physical ailments that I personally believe are a function of racial trauma that has gone untreated. And so I think for children specifically, what you'll see is either internalizing some of those symptoms of, I'm a bad person, I'm ugly, I'm just a horrible human, I have nothing to give to this world, and so I'm going to turn it inwards, or you see it externally, and that's where you see the violence, right? That's where you see the aggression, that's where you see the anger. And so I think people respond to racism in different ways. Some people maybe have learned to kind of suppress it and act like it's not a thing, or try to, hide it. And then some people are like, no, I'm going to let you know that I'm hurting. I'm just not going to tell you. I'm going to show you, right? And so I think we all respond differently, but I think it's important to notice the difference, right? So if you have a child and you see that their behavior is kind of off, that's important to kind of question and figure out
Right.
what's going on, because there are signs there that I think a lot of us kind of overlook, because it's just racism is normal for a lot of us, right?
Okay, Quentin, how does it impact my child in the future?
Oh, wow. In the future, I think it impacts because as a child, they're going to experience it. Sometimes we think that, they're little adults and they're not. The way that they absorb is differently. So when you have a child that says, my teacher doesn't like me because I'm Black, we say, well, you're using that as an excuse instead of perhaps investigating it. Or when a child sees a police officer and they get nervous and they're like, forget the police or F the police, processing that, because it can look like anger. And also knowing the individuals and yourself around you. Are you isolating or are you angry because of something that was said? This impacts our children in the future because they need a healthy outlook. We know that in the 60s, when there was a lot of racial struggle and racial trauma going on, one of the beautiful things that came out of it was I'm Black and I'm proud. The whole idea of knowing who I am, my identity, I am not ugly, I am not this, I am powerful. So I think that trauma can be positive and impact children in the future like that.
Absolutely.
So coming out with that sense of identity and who you are. And everyone's Blackness is different. Some people don't relate to certain images or stereotypes of what everybody's supposed to be, because every Black person is individual. So I think having that conversation with children and talking about it, letting them process it in a safe environment is really what's needed. And if we don't, like it's
Oh no, don't keep going. I want to
men
hear
or adults.
Oh, there
this.
you
Oh my God, Quentin, you had us all on the edge of our seats,
Well, it's
That
true.
was-
I think we look at like the negative symptoms of trauma and we know that those are there and we know it needs to be processed. There's even racial trauma therapy now, as we know. So definitely it needs to be processed, but we also need to look at what's the beautiful thing that may come out of this.
Wow.
What's the beautiful thing of being told that I'm ugly? What's the beautiful thing of being paranoid when I see the police, right? Processing that and growing from it. So I think, and children are very intelligent. They want to have these discussions.
Very true. Very true.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
So we kind of talked about this earlier. Our previous topics were gun violence and depression and suicide. How do you all feel that racial trauma impacts some of those topics? Does it look different? What's the impact, Jordan?
I would say that a consequence of racial trauma is in my opinion, internalized racism. And so that's where you internalize society's larger views and beliefs and opinions, whatever they may be, about Blackness and about your value and your worth, and what you can contribute to society. And so I think that oftentimes when we see gun violence, when we see depression, when we see suicide, what we have to realize is that like this country was built off of violence, and it was violence specifically towards us, right? So a lot of ways, youth are not just understanding violence in their communities from their families, they're understanding it from how they've been raised in the society, how they've been socialized, and how larger society views them, right? And so when we don't have those conversations, like what Mr. Quentin said with our children, then we leave them susceptible to hearing all of these messages from other people rather than hearing it from us.
Right.
And so I think that oftentimes we may internalize it, like I said, and we learn to be violent towards each other because we don't see each other's worth. And so, you know, when I sit across from clients and I say, you know, you're worthy, whether you do anything tomorrow or not, some people cringe, some people cry, just because we're not used to hearing that. And so I think that if we could really recognize our worth and our value, then we would maybe see a little bit less violence. But that starts in the home.
Wow.
That's so
It's
good.
powerful.
Mhm.
Powerful.
Sharika, you're worthy, honey. We're worthy.
We are worthy. Say it
Okay.
enough and I believe it, honey.
So, okay, let's talk about the importance in checking in on your community. The
Mhm.
people around you, the people that you know, the next door neighbors, the ones that's a block over. What's the importance in making sure that, you know, they're okay, especially during a time when you know we're about to be back on lockdown and told to stay back at home and we're isolated from, you know, the things that we're used to. Quentin, what's the importance of, you know, keeping that connection with the people around you?
Very important, since it is collective trauma and we all experience it differently. I always like to use the example of an airplane, right? You
Yeah.
got to put the oxygen mask on yourself first before you can help anyone else. So I think being honest with yourself about how racial trauma or stressors have really affected you, and then perhaps having that conversation with someone close to you that you can trust, because just like any therapy or treatment, you need a safe place where you can process it. And so I think reaching out is important. Looking around you to see who may have similar experiences and talking about those experiences, and also being able to confront and challenge those microaggressions and challenges when they come, and have discussions about how to do that in a healthy way, right? Because sometimes when we even talk about racial trauma, it's like, there they go again, pulling the race card, right? So I think it's very important that we acknowledge each other and that we talk about it in a safe space. And I think reaching out is how we do that. This platform is a perfect example. I think during this time, it only means that we have to be a little bit more creative.
I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Jordan, but that was so good, Quentin.
I love that. I'll add really briefly that I call, we talk a lot about self-care, but I think a missing component of that is collective care. And so, you know, being amongst other people where you feel safe, where you feel loved, where you feel supported is also a way that you can cope with racial trauma, right? When you go home and you say, wow, let me tell you about my day, and you just have that love there, that's the way that you can also resist, you know, just outside stressors. So if you want to call it community care, collective care, that's a form of self-care. And so just like we talk about taking care of yourself with the airplane analogy, take care of each other too.
Right, I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So you all brought it up, self-care, taking care of each other, taking care of myself. How can I find resources? If my child, or if I'm, you know, starting to think maybe I am suffering from some racial trauma or trauma of any kind, or depression or suicide, what resources are available for me in the community and also in Fayette County Public Schools? What resources are there? Quentin, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll just say that I think we've been really blessed in Fayette County to have a wealth of mental health specialists, of people that are specialists in this and can really help out.
Yes.
I think also looking at it as an individual thing, creating a toolbox for yourself. Coping skills are individual. They're customized. So knowing what you need in order to cope with these stressors every day reaching out, asking for help. You know, old folks used to say, closed mouth don't get fed. So we got to start talking about it and communicating and asking questions. And also, you know, educating ourselves, doing the research. We got, you know, the worldwide internet at the top of our fingertips. And there's some really good people doing some really good research out there. I'm sure there's going to be some links in the end that people can click on and go to. And so, yeah, don't be scared to ask questions and talk about it, because if you keep it in the dark, then it'll remain in the dark.
Mhm. I'll
Jordan?
tag on with community resources. So I'm a therapist and I actually do racial trauma therapy, like Mr. Quentin mentioned. So two great resources in the community where you can get therapy, individual, group, family, is the Center for Healing Racial Trauma in Lexington. That has openings that we'll drop the link in the chat, I'm assuming. But also in Louisville, if you're not, you know, maybe in Fayette County, you want to drive out to Louisville, the Collective Care Center. I also worked there for a year. And that's a, you know, community clinic specializing in healing racial trauma. So there are resources out there right here in our own neighborhood. And so we're so innovative that also, if you don't want to do therapy, because that's a thing, create your own healing circle, right? Get you together, some friends, and talk it out, and just, you know, really be in community together. That's very much healing as well.
Yeah.
Support system is real, right?
I'm gonna throw a wrench. Sorry, Melody.
That's okay.
So I'm just gonna go ahead and comment on the elephant in the room. Sometimes Black families don't get help, right? What happens in my family stays in my family. I grew up that way. I don't want to assume that y'all did, but we know a lot of, and not just Black families, but a lot of cultures, you know, live by that. So how do we get past those barriers for seeking help? How do we get past that?
Great question.
I think that's a great question. And I really don't think it's one correct answer. I really, really do think it's about communication and talking and asking questions. And if you see someone that you know ain't gonna talk about it, but is suffering, then to start the conversation. And sometimes you have to do some pre-planning because people are guarded. I just saw a statistic that said, you know, of mental health clinicians and psychologists, something like only 4 to 5% are African Americans. So finding a clinician that you relate to that doesn't necessarily have to be African American, but understands your plight. I think that's very, very important. So yeah, the barriers are there, but I don't think it should stop us. I think people can get treatment in many different ways and expression through art, through music. Some of the most beautiful things came out of the 60s in the civil rights struggle when people were oppressed. So learning how to express yourself and reach out in different ways through music, through art, through, like you said, community circles, through parties, through whatever you got to do, you know, in order to communicate and also celebrate yourself. I think we miss about the celebration of who we are. And that's the opposite of oppression, right?
Yeah, I'll also say social media. Social media is becoming a thing where we have a lot of mental health advocates. We have a lot of folks who are trying to demystify mental health, break down the barriers, the stigmas, the stereotypes, all of that. So if you are not in a place where you're ready to seek treatment, maybe you want to follow a couple pages, like, you know, and just kind of seek it out and see what people are saying and kind of look at the comments. You know, I think we all need that space to kind of see things out and try them out before we just dive in. So social media is definitely a tool, and, you know, you can follow those pages and it's not going to necessarily hurt you to do so. So
let me add a little bit. Sorry to kind of throw off that whole thing, but it was a great question. And what I would like to add, because I would like to answer, I typically don't answer anything. But what I would say is sometimes we have to be vulnerable for our community. And that means sometimes you yourself have to say, I've done it. I literally, Melody Westerfield, have done it in a time in my life when I needed it. You know, and so sometimes being vulnerable and letting people know that I've actually done this walk myself and I've healed and I've gone through some things and I've come out on the other side because of it actually opens the door for other people to say, okay, well, maybe it's not bad at all because I see her, you know. And so, you know, that's with our families, our friends. I actually have friends who was, yeah, I'm doing it. So sometimes being that poster child of, you know, You know, Charlemagne the God, he's pushing for Black men right now to go to therapy, you know. So sometimes being that person to say, I've done it, also helps our community. And that's just my 2 cents. But that was a great question, Sharika. I love it. And so with that, engaging in those conversations about racial trauma, you know, how do we engage in those conversations? How do we have those conversations? And maybe we just answered that with that right there by itself. Maybe we don't need to, you know, go back in it, because I feel like that was the answer. How do we engage? I mean, and I feel like you both answered, but if you have something else to add, feel free.
I'll
I
just
think
reiterate.
yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're good. I was going to say, especially starting the conversation. I know Quentin earlier said kids want to talk about this, you know, so
Mhm.
really starting
Yeah.
that conversation.
I was just gonna say, don't skip the conversation, right? Even if it's uncomfortable, you don't know where it's gonna go, you don't know what your kids are gonna say, you don't know if you're gonna be able to handle it. Do not skip the conversation. Kids are very willing and able to have these conversations. Sometimes they just are waiting for you to open that door, right? And so I think, at least for me, like kind of like what Sharika said, sometimes secrets are a thing for a lot of families, but especially in our communities. And so that's how trauma also gets passed along, is when we carry these secrets and we don't close those generational doors. So when we have these conversations and open this communication, we are closing doors to trauma, believe it or not. So definitely don't skip out on the opportunity to broach those conversations with your kids and, you know, your loved ones.
That's really good. Thank you.
Yeah. So one more question. I'm always throwing those wrenches. So
You
what
just
if
said-
you have, you know, people at work or your friends or your family who always come to you with this conversation about racism or racial trauma or trauma in general? They always come to you. And sometimes it's exhausting, right? You're mentally drained. You just kind of want to take a break. How do you protect your peace when you're kind of at that breaking point or just kind of need a break from that? How do I protect my peace? Quentin, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I'll go back to creating a toolbox for yourself.
I love it.
Knowing what brings you peace, knowing what brings you joy, knowing how to decompress, you know, reverie, sitting still and being quiet for a moment and see what comes to you. I think we have to be very strategic about that and deliberate about that, because it's easy to talk about, it's hard to do. So create a toolbox for yourself. You know, when you get overwhelmed, like I said, you got to put the oxygen mask on yourself first. You may have to be the one to go through racial trauma therapy first, right? Or you may have to be the one to be honest with yourself. Like Sharika said, I'm overwhelmed. I hear this all the time. Sharika, do you hear this all the time? Do people come to you all the time like that as a clinician, right? So just having that conversation and getting it off your chest, learning how to express yourself about it. And I think that is hard because we have been taught to be guarded. We have been taught to kind of handle it on our own, not talk about it. But it's breaking the mold. I mean, just the other day, I saw a show with Dr. Siri Singh, the therapist, where he has therapy with all these musical artists from Keith, right, to all these people. We didn't see that about 5 years ago. So I think just conversations are changing. And so the more we talk about it, the more we have it on social media, the more we try to help people through it, it will become popular and more people will start to engage, I think.
That was good. So we're going to wrap up, right? Before we do, we just want you to quickly give our listeners, our watchers, just some encouraging words on the topic, right? They're watching out here, they want to know. And so, you know, because it's a heavy topic, we just want to allow you all to, you know, quickly give some encouraging words for our viewers.
Who wants to start?
Yeah, I never say who goes. Jordan, go.
I'll start. I'll say that just a loving reminder that the greatest forms of resistance are self-love, joy, compassion, resilience, coping, right? And so I say this to myself every day, that your ancestors are so proud of you. And collectively, if you rely on each other, we will get through it like we have always, right? So just to remember to put yourself first and also put your community first, and we will make it through.
Yeah. Quentin?
The sister said it beautifully. I couldn't say it any better. I think not only is racial trauma collective as far as history, but also our resilience is collective and what our ancestors came and overcame. And I also would say, study yourself and know yourself.
Yep.
First.
Okay.
Love it.
Jordan, I'll make an appointment with you here soon, okay? Yeah, let's do that. Okay, so well, thank you all for all the great information. They are actually very gifts for us and our watchers. So we thank you all for that tonight and the resources that you provided for our families and community. Thank you, everybody who's out there watching the show and joining us for the Face It Live show. We like staying in touch with you. We like staying connected and building our community of support for our families. And so Sharika always, every week after week, she tells us how we can do that.
Yes. So we love, just like Melody said, we want to share with each other how are you all facing it at home. So everyone who's watching, if you watch it now or later, send us words of encouragement, send us pictures, videos, show us how you and your family are facing this pandemic, this trauma, racial trauma, these, everything. How are you all facing it together? So you can text those to us at 859-903-5531, or you can email them to us at fayette.kyschools.us. And also, we have another giveaway going on right now. So if you're watching or if you see this later, please post a comment on our page about who or what you are grateful for. Melody and I are so grateful for Quentin and Jordan this evening. So you all tell us what you're grateful for, and you will be entered into a chance to win a $25 Walmart gift card.
Absolutely. And we can't win, so you're in luck. Okay. So as a reminder, if you missed the previous two shows from our collective 3-part trauma series, gun violence, depression and suicide, and this racial trauma, please go back and watch all shows, all 3 shows. If you have any questions or want any further conversation or follow-up questions, please post that on the actual under the page, or you can email from what Sharika gave you, the email and the text number, so you can text those questions and those topics there as well. Our next Face It show will focus on FAFSA preparation and college preparation for our parents and students. And that will be December 3rd at 6:30. So you all stay tuned. That's coming up. As always, we love staying connected with you all, and we will continue to face it together. See you soon.
Bye, everybody.